What if I told you a man could be sentenced to life in prison without a single piece of physical evidence tying him to the crime? No weapon, no DNA, no surveillance footage, just two witnesses, and years later, both of them say they got it wrong. This is the story of C. Murder, a name once at the center of the Southern rap explosion, now at the center of one of the most debated criminal cases in modern hip-hop history. Back in 2002, a night at a crowded nightclub ended in tragedy when a 16-year-old fan, Steve Thomas, was shot and killed. Within months, the finger was pointed at a celebrity in the building. The case seemed straightforward, until it wasn't. Convictions overturned, retrials, a controversial 10-2 jury verdict, and a system that would later admit that kind of verdict should never have been allowed. Add in recanted testimony, claims of pressure, and high-profile voices demanding justice. And suddenly this isn't just a case, it's a question. Did the system get it right, or did it fail in a way that can't be undone? The story of C. Murder doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins in the streets of New Orleans, in a neighborhood that shaped not just a person, but an entire mindset. Born on March 9, 1971, Corey Miller grew up in the Calliope Projects, one of the toughest housing developments in the city. Life there wasn't easy. Crime, poverty, and survival were part of everyday reality. But inside that environment, something else was growing too: ambition. His older brother, Master P, had a vision that would eventually change all of their lives. Before music ever entered the picture, Corey took a completely different path. After high school, he joined the U.S. Army and served as a combat medic during the Gulf War. It's a part of his story many people overlook. Before the fame, before the headlines, he was a soldier. But when he returned home, the direction of his life shifted. Master P had already started building something powerful with No Limit Records, turning a small record store into a rapidly growing music empire. Corey stepped into that world and took on the name C. Murder, a name that would soon become widely recognized across the country. By the late 1990s, No Limit Records was dominating the rap industry. Albums were dropping constantly, artists were going platinum, and the label had built a movement that felt unstoppable. C. Murder wasn't just riding the wave, he became a key part of it. As a member of the group TRU alongside Master P and Silk the Shocker, he helped define the sound that was coming out of the South. But it was his solo career that really put him on the map. In 1998, he released his debut album, Life or Death, and it made an immediate impact, climbing to number 3 on the Billboard 200 and eventually going platinum. That kind of success doesn't happen by accident. It meant people were listening, people were paying attention. Then came Bossellini in 1999, which reached number 2 on the charts, followed by Trapped in Crime in 2000, another top 10 project. 3 albums in 3 years, all successful. At that point, C. Murder wasn't just another artist. He was a major name in hip-hop. Everything about his career suggested momentum. The fame, the money, the recognition, it was all there. But success doesn't erase where you come from, and it doesn't shield you from what's around you. By the early 2000s, while his music career was still strong, there were already signs of trouble building in the background. Legal issues had started to appear, and his public image was becoming more complicated. Still, nothing could have prepared anyone for what was about to happen next. On the night of January 12, 2002, everything changed. A nightclub called the Platinum Club in Harvey, Louisiana was packed. It was the kind of night where energy is high, music is loud, and people are just trying to have a good time. Among the crowd was a 16-year-old fan named Steve Thomas. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't part of the industry, he was just a kid who showed up that night, like so many others. Somewhere in the chaos of that crowded club, a fight broke out. Details about exactly how it started have always been unclear, but what is known is that the situation escalated quickly. In the middle of that confusion, a gun was fired. When it was over, Steve Thomas had been shot and killed. A teenager who walked into a nightclub never walked out. Moments like that create immediate pressure. People want answers, and they want them fast. In a crowded environment with hundreds of people, conflicting stories begin almost instantly. Who did what? Who saw what? It becomes difficult to separate fact from assumption. But in this case, attention quickly turned toward one person who was known to be present that night. C. Murder. Within days, the situation intensified. On January 18, 2002, Corey Miller was arrested following an unrelated disturbance at the House of Blues in New Orleans. Not long after, he was formally charged in connection with the nightclub shooting. The case against him began to take shape, and from that moment forward, his life moved in a completely different direction. As the investigation unfolded, the prosecution built its case around eyewitness accounts. Two individuals, Darnell Jordan and Kenneth Jordan, claimed they saw C. Murder pull the trigger. Their testimony became the foundation of the entire case. There was no weapon recovered that tied directly to him. No DNA evidence placing him as the shooter. No video footage capturing the moment. No confession. Just statements from witnesses who said they saw what happened. And in the legal system, that can be enough. But even early on, there were questions. In situations involving crowded scenes and high stress, eyewitness testimony isn't always as reliable as people assume. Memory can be affected by fear, confusion, and the sheer speed at which events unfold. Still, prosecutors moved forward, confident in the statements they had. In 2003, C. Murder was convicted of second-degree murder. For many, that seemed like the end of the story. A conviction had been secured, and the case appeared closed. But behind the scenes, issues were already emerging that would keep this case alive for years to come. Not long after the conviction, something significant happened. A judge granted a new trial in 2004 after it was revealed that prosecutors had failed to disclose important information about some of their witnesses, including aspects of their criminal backgrounds. That kind of information can influence how a jury evaluates credibility. Without it, the defense argued, the jury didn't have the full picture. The conviction was overturned, and suddenly what looked like a finished case was reopened. C. Murder was released on bond in 2006 and placed under house arrest while waiting for a retrial. For a moment, it seemed like there was a real chance things could turn out differently. During that period, he tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. He continued working on music, promoting projects, and staying connected to his career. But the case was far from over. The retrial was coming, and the stakes were even higher than before. At the same time, another legal issue surfaced that complicated everything. In a separate case stemming from a 2001 incident at a nightclub in Baton Rouge, C. Murder faced charges related to attempted second-degree murder. He eventually entered a no-contest plea in 2009 and received a sentence that added further weight to his legal situation. Even though it was a different case, it had an impact. When someone is already facing serious accusations, any additional conviction can shape how they are perceived, both publicly and in court. It adds layers to the narrative, whether those layers are directly connected or not. As the retrial approached in 2009, the focus returned to the original case, the death of Steve Thomas. The prosecution once again leaned heavily on eyewitness testimony, presenting a version of events that pointed directly at C. Murder. The defense, on the other hand, prepared to challenge those accounts and highlight the lack of physical evidence. This time, everything would come down to how a new jury interpreted the same core question: what really happened inside that nightclub? And this is where the story begins to shift from a straightforward criminal case into something far more complicated. Something that would raise questions not just about one man's guilt or innocence, but about the system itself. When the retrial began in 2009, the pressure in that courtroom was completely different from the first time. This wasn't just about presenting evidence anymore. It was about correcting what the court had already acknowledged was a flawed process. The earlier conviction had been thrown out, and now both sides knew that every detail, every word, and every witness would be examined more closely than ever before. But even with that heightened scrutiny, the core of the case remained the same. The prosecution once again leaned heavily on eyewitness testimony. They brought forward accounts that placed C. Murder at the center of the shooting, arguing that he was the one who pulled the trigger inside that crowded nightclub. The narrative didn't change much from the first trial. According to their version, in the chaos of that night, he fired the fatal shot that killed Steve Thomas. It was a simple argument, but it depended almost entirely on whether the jury believed the witnesses. On the other side, the defense focused on what wasn't there. No gun had ever been recovered that could be tied directly to him. There was still no DNA evidence linking him to the shooting, no surveillance footage capturing the act, no confession. The defense argued that the case was built on unreliable accounts from individuals who could have been mistaken or influenced by the circumstances around them. They pushed the idea that in a crowded, chaotic environment, certainty is hard to come by. As the trial moved forward, tension started to build around the jury itself. After hearing the evidence, the jury went into deliberation. At one point, they came back and reported that they were deadlocked. That moment matters because a deadlocked jury usually means there isn't enough agreement to reach a verdict. In most situations across the United States, that would lead to a hung jury and potentially another trial. But this case wasn't happening under the rules most people are familiar with. At the time, Louisiana law allowed for non-unanimous jury verdicts. That meant a person could be convicted even if not every juror agreed. It's a detail that would later become one of the most controversial aspects of this entire case. After being told to continue deliberating, the jury returned with a 10-2 verdict, guilty. 2 jurors did not agree with the decision, but under Louisiana law at the time, that didn't stop the conviction. And just like that, the case reached a conclusion that would define the rest of Corey Miller's life. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But what happened inside that jury room didn't stay there. One of the jurors later spoke out, describing the environment during deliberations as intense and overwhelming. She claimed that there was significant pressure placed on those who initially voted not guilty. According to her account, arguments became heated, and at least one juror felt targeted for refusing to change their position. She even stated that she eventually changed her vote, not because the evidence convinced her, but because the situation had become too much to handle. That kind of statement raises serious questions. If a juror changes their vote due to pressure rather than belief in the evidence, it challenges the integrity of the verdict. But in the legal system, proving that kind of influence is extremely difficult. Courts generally protect the secrecy of jury deliberations, and unless there is clear evidence of misconduct, those internal dynamics rarely overturn a conviction. Not long after, the legal landscape around jury verdicts began to shift. In 2020, the United States Supreme Court made a major decision in Ramos versus Louisiana. The court ruled that non-unanimous jury verdicts in criminal cases are unconstitutional. That decision effectively changed the rules nationwide, requiring that juries must agree unanimously in order to convict someone of a serious crime. For many people following this case, that ruling felt like validation. It confirmed what critics had been saying for years, that a 10-2 verdict should never have been enough to send someone to prison for life. It raised a powerful question. If that same trial happened today, would the outcome have been different? But that moment of hope didn't last long. In a follow-up decision, Edwards versus Vinoy, the Supreme Court ruled that the requirement for unanimous juries would not apply retroactively to cases that had already been finalized. That meant people like Corey Miller, whose appeals had already run their course, could not benefit from the new rule. So even though the system acknowledged that the kind of verdict used to convict him was unconstitutional, it didn't change his situation. He remained in prison, serving the same life sentence. At that point, attention began to shift toward another major development in the case: the witnesses. Years after the trial, both of the key eyewitnesses who had testified against him came forward with new statements. They claimed that their original testimony was not truthful. One of them said he felt pressured by law enforcement, suggesting that he was pushed into identifying C. Murder as the shooter under threat of facing his own legal consequences. The other also expressed doubts about his earlier testimony, stating that he no longer stood by what he had said in court. On the surface, that kind of development seems like it should change everything. If the very people whose testimony secured the conviction are now saying they were wrong, it raises immediate doubts about the outcome of the trial. But legally, it's not that simple. Courts treat recantations with a high level of skepticism. The reasoning is that testimony given under oath during a trial is considered more reliable than statements made years later, especially when those later statements aren't subject to the same level of cross-examination. Judges often look for consistency, timing, and possible motivations behind the change in story. In this case, when the recantations were presented, the court reviewed them carefully, but ultimately the judge ruled that the new statements were not credible enough to justify a new trial. The decision pointed to inconsistencies and contradictions within the recantations, suggesting that they couldn't be relied upon as solid evidence. That ruling was a major setback for the defense. It meant that even one of the strongest arguments for reopening the case, the witnesses changing their stories, was not enough to move things forward. And there was another layer to this issue that made things even more complicated. Under Louisiana law, a person who admits to lying under oath can face serious consequences, including charges of perjury. That creates a difficult situation for anyone trying to recant their testimony. If they say they lied during the trial, they risk prosecution. If they stick to their original story, they maintain the conviction. It's a legal trap that discourages people from coming forward, even if they believe a mistake was made. As these developments unfolded, the case began attracting attention beyond the courtroom. Public figures started to get involved, bringing more visibility to the situation. One of the most notable voices was Kim Kardashian, who has been involved in several criminal justice reform efforts. She publicly expressed support for Corey Miller, arguing that he deserved another opportunity to have his case reviewed in light of the new claims. Her involvement brought a new level of attention, especially among audiences who may not have been familiar with the details before. Alongside her, civil rights attorney Ben Crump joined the legal team, signaling that there were serious concerns about how the case had been handled. But even with increased visibility and support, the legal reality didn't change. Appeals continued to be filed, arguments continued to be made, but the courts consistently ruled against granting a new trial. Each denial reinforced the same conclusion. The evidence presented after the conviction was not strong enough to overturn it. And while all of this was happening, there was another side to the story that often gets less attention: the family of Steve Thomas. For them, this case isn't about legal arguments or technicalities. It's about a 16-year-old who lost his life. Every time the case resurfaces, every time new claims are made, it brings that loss back into focus. From their perspective, the conviction brought a sense of justice, and challenges to that conviction can feel like reopening a wound that never fully healed. By this point, the case had evolved into something much larger than a single verdict. It had become a symbol of larger issues: how reliable eyewitness testimony can be, how the legal system handles recantations, and what happens when the rules themselves change after a conviction has already been made. But despite all the debate, all the attention, and all the unanswered questions, one thing remained unchanged. Corey Miller was still in prison. And heading into the next phase of this story, the question wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about whether anything could still change. By the time the case reached the mid-2020s, it had already gone through years of trials, appeals, and public debate. But the legal reality remained unchanged. C. Murder was still behind bars, serving a life sentence, while his legal team continued searching for any path that could reopen the case. At this stage, the fight was no longer about a single appeal. It was about finding anything strong enough to break through a system that had already rejected multiple challenges. One of the last remaining legal avenues was post-conviction relief, a process that allows new evidence or constitutional violations to be reviewed after a conviction is finalized. The defense continued to argue that the combination of recanted testimony, lack of physical evidence, and juror pressure should be enough to at least grant a new hearing. But courts operate on strict standards. It's not enough to raise doubt. You have to present evidence that is both new and reliable enough that it could likely change the outcome of a trial. That standard is where this case has consistently hit a wall. Despite the attention and the arguments, multiple courts reviewed the claims and came to the same conclusion. The new evidence presented did not meet the threshold required to overturn the conviction. Federal courts, including the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, denied attempts to move forward, stating that there wasn't a substantial showing of a constitutional violation that would justify intervention. Then came one of the most recent and significant developments. In early 2026, the Louisiana Supreme Court made a decisive move. It declined to hear another appeal in the case. That decision matters because when a state's highest court refuses to review a case, it effectively closes one of the final doors available within that legal system. And this wasn't a split decision or a narrow ruling. The court unanimously chose not to take up the case. That kind of outcome sends a clear message about how the legal system currently views the claims being presented. At that point, the situation became even more difficult. When both state and federal courts have denied relief multiple times, the remaining options become extremely limited. One of those options is clemency, a decision that would come from the governor rather than the courts. Clemency isn't about proving innocence in the traditional legal sense. It's about whether there are enough reasons, legal, humanitarian, or otherwise, to justify reducing a sentence or granting release. But clemency is rare, especially in cases involving serious violent crimes. It requires not only legal arguments, but also political will, public support, and a belief that granting it would serve justice rather than undermine it. There's also the possibility of a federal habeas corpus petition, but that route has already been pursued without success. These petitions are limited in scope and are often denied unless there is a clear violation of constitutional rights that has not been addressed before. So where does that leave the case? Legally, it places Corey Miller in a position where the system has already made its decisions, repeatedly. But outside of the courtroom, the conversation continues. Supporters argue that the combination of factors, recanted witnesses, a non-unanimous jury, and the absence of physical evidence, creates too much doubt to ignore. They see the case as an example of how the justice system can fail, particularly when initial convictions are built on testimony that later falls apart. On the other side, there are those who believe the courts have already done their job. They point out that multiple judges have reviewed the evidence, including the recantations, and found them unreliable. They argue that the legal process has been followed, that appeals have been exhausted, and that the conviction should stand. And then there's the perspective that often gets lost in the debate, the family of Steve Thomas. For them, this isn't about legal theory or public opinion. It's about a life that was taken, a teenager who went out one night and never came home. While others argue over evidence and procedure, they continue to live with the outcome of that night. As the years have passed, the case has also drawn in high-profile supporters. Kim Kardashian has continued to advocate for a review, using her platform to highlight what she sees as serious issues within the case. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has also been involved, signaling that the concerns go beyond just celebrity attention. They touch on broader questions about fairness and due process. Even within his own family, there have been different perspectives. His brother, Master P, has publicly stated that there was a point where a plea deal was on the table, one that could have resulted in a much shorter sentence. According to him, that deal wasn't taken. That decision adds another layer to the story, raising questions about strategy, principle, and the risks involved in choosing to fight a case rather than settle it. From one point of view, refusing a deal can be seen as standing firm on innocence. Why admit to something you didn't do? From another, it can be seen as a gamble that didn't pay off, especially when the alternative could have meant eventual freedom. As of now, the reality is clear. Corey Miller remains incarcerated. There has been no release, no exoneration, and no court ruling that overturns his conviction. The claims of new evidence proving his innocence have not been accepted in a legal setting. The system, for better or worse, has held its position. But the story doesn't end there. Cases like this don't simply disappear, especially when they continue to raise unanswered questions. The debate around eyewitness reliability, jury dynamics, and post-conviction relief isn't going away. If anything, cases like this keep those conversations alive, forcing people to look more closely at how justice is carried out. There is still a possibility, however small, that something could change in the future. A new piece of evidence, a shift in legal standards, or a decision from a governor could alter the course of the case. But those possibilities are uncertain, and they come with no guarantees. For now, the situation exists in a kind of standstill. The legal system has spoken, but the public conversation continues. Supporters keep pushing, critics remain unconvinced, and the truth, whatever it may be, remains at the center of it all. And maybe that's why this case still holds so much attention. Because it doesn't offer a simple answer. It sits in that uncomfortable space where doubt, belief, and legal reality all collide. A man says he's innocent. Witnesses say they were wrong. Courts say the evidence isn't enough. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a life sentence continues to be served. Whether that ever changes is a question that, for now, remains unanswered.